I believe that climate change is an environmental issue that will affect everyone. I'm concerned there is not enough information about climate change given to the youth and the potentially devastating effects it may have on our lives and world. Climate change is also not a topic we talk about during school. In fact, we have not had any subjects including in the environment at all. This should be a subject that focuses on climate change in the environment that is mandatory for our high school students. People around the ages of 13 to 20 need to be more aware of what is happening in the world and less about celebrities' lives. To engage youth, it is best to use what they use on a daily basis. Social media is something that every teenager uses multiple times a day.
I feel as if climate change in general society is heard but not listened to, and is seen but not acted upon. Especially from a youth perspective, considering we have a reputation to maintain, both in real life and on the world of social media, schoolwork to complete and our futures to worry about, I believe climate change, sadly, isn't on the list of youth priorities. Engaging youth as well as all ages, from primary school to adulthood, I think is extremely important. I think a few ways to get youth attention is to educate them in an interesting way that is mandatory in the Australian curriculum. I think climate change can be included and taught with deeper understanding under natural sciences, climatology or earth science topics.
So there are areas this is one of the points where we have responses to things like droughts, which are anticipating that we will see periods as in the past where we see dry periods, and then we come out of that and we go back into the period where we get some wetter years and everything sort of evens out of there. But we're moving to something different, and it's not clear that our responses across government are really justice to that fact yet. We're seeing a lot of activity happening in climate change adaptation in terms of adaptation plans being developed, but are they connected strongly enough through to our business as usual activities in a whole range of areas, so that we're linking up our adaptation planning through to our business as usual activity? I think there's some work there to be done with that yet. And so we're seeing one emission scenario, 2.6, well, it's also total warming of about 2 degrees. 8.5, up around 4, possibly 5 or 6 degrees of warming globally. So, I guess one of the key things, look at that graph at the global temperatures, over the next couple of decades, there's not a lot of difference between the scenarios. So this is one of the really key points to take away. We're in line for some future warming. Even if emissions totally stopped today, we would get another about half a degree warming in terms of the global climate. Under a low emission scenario, we would see about another 2 degrees, about another degree over the next few decades. So we're locked into some future warming regardless of our scenario. That's important to keep in mind. There is further adaptation required, whether we like it or not. But quite clearly, there is a very strong life mitigation. There's quite a different choice longer term, past about 2040, 2050, in terms of the outcomes, very strongly depending on our emissions and how much mitigation we put in place. The International Energy Agency does an audit of greenhouse emissions from year to year. Now, apart from some years where we've had economic crises around the world, until recently, greenhouse gas emissions have risen steadily from here to there. They've been increasing steadily year after year until last year, where they've estimated that greenhouse gas emissions from human activity stayed the same in 2014 as they did in 2013. That's a really promising sign that maybe we are starting to turn around our greenhouse gas emissions from things like the shift to renewables, the shift to gas that's happening in the US, and increasing our energy efficiency. So a whole range of things that we're starting to do, maybe starting to have some effect on human emissions. Renewable energy is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. It's really starting to become the cheap option to go to for energy. And so there's a whole range of reports indicating that we can transform our energy systems, and that's starting to occur. And this is looking to be much easier and cheaper than anticipated.
Now, the Premier and the Minister were recently in France, where there was a States and Regions Alliance meeting in the lead up to Paris. President Hollande was there, and I went along as, and it was remarkable for me because to listen to other countries and other states and other cities and local government talk about climate change in the way they talk about it, it struck home to me that it is so highly politicised in Australia, and the media have such, like the Andrew Bolts of the world, have such an influence on it, which is very, very, very different to what's happening with the world. And if you only relied on News Limited, you would have a very skewed view of really what's happening on a global scale. So if I go just to some of the things within Carbon Neutral Adelaide, the Premier really sees this as a signature a policy for him. It's an iconic thing that he believes will bring some activity, some changes into the way we are as a city, that not only will you reduce emissions, but you will change the fabric of how this city operates. I think one of the things that is a real challenge for government is that climate change as a policy sits within the Department of Environment and Water Natural Resources. So it sits in the unit that I'm part of. However, to get real action, it means we need to have the Department of State Development, who manages electricity and electricity contracts and energy efficiency. It means our Transport Department and the Planning Department need to be very much plugged in. And I think that's probably the biggest learning, is that we can work and try and drive things as much as possible, but the buy-in at some of these key departments who have the levers to implement and impact climate change is where we want to be. Legislative basis, so our existing legislation, very much about renewable energy targets, emissions reduction targets, not that much on adaptation. So what could we put in the legislation which would be binding and help us? Or is that the way to go?
So the first point I just want to make is that adaptation is good business, is that if you're actually not adapting as the world changes around you, you're actually going to underperform or you're going to incur increasing risk. And it doesn't matter whether this is in relation to climate or currency fluctuations or changes in technology or market demands and specifications. It's simply a truism. If the world changes around you and if you don't change with it, you will actually underperform or you incur increasing risk. And that's important, whether you're a farm business person or whether you're an urban developer or anyone else. It's actually really a fundamental thing. You actually move with the times. Our past climate is no longer necessarily a good indicator of future climate risk, future climate opportunity. And so we need to start thinking about taking a much more dynamic approach to risk management. So if you're the traditional way of, say, looking at frost risk in agriculture would be you take a 100-year view in a climate record, you'd assess your frost risk and you'd take action accordingly, say in terms of planting dates. But what has happened in parts of Australia, in the north, we've had really significant reductions in frost risk, and that's that little graph up there showing the first and last day's frost in emerald, and it's really collapsed over a long period of time, really strong and long trend to reducing frost. But in south of Australia, we've actually got an increasing frost risk, and Darren mentioned part of that in his talk. So what we did in this particular study, we said, okay, well, if you simulate, in this case, a wheat grower, and simulate a situation where they ignore frost risk entirely. So planting is based on soil moisture. Or you could have a strategy which is use the 100-year climate record on the basis of frost risk. So you make a good 100-year sort of risk assessment. Or you could take a moving window, like a 10-year moving window, to assess your frost risk. You also need to understand what are the decision points. So what can you actually do and when? And Mark Siebentritt will probably talk about that this afternoon. And part of that is about understanding the windows of opportunity. So politically or in business or climatically, there's often particular windows where you can actually grab that opportunity and make a significant change because it just opens up sort of lower cost and more effective ways of doing things. So it's actually preparing yourself strategically to grab those tactical opportunities which windows of opportunity open. And I've got a really growing concern that the research community isn't necessarily delivering the science that's needed in the right way to people who are actually looking to research for information and answers. The adaptation results are often a function of who is approached rather than the needs of the stakeholders. So if you approach a social science, you're going to get a social science answer for adaptation. If it's an economist, you'll get an economic answer for adaptation. If it's an agronomist, you'll get an agronomic answer for adaptation. So who you approach ends up with the solution that you're expected to adopt. And that's clearly unacceptable. It would be unacceptable if you went to an accountant or a doctor or a lawyer, because you'd actually expect professional, invariant advice. And if it isn't professional and essentially standardised, converging on a similar solution, you know we've got a problem. And we have mechanisms to actually deal with this, say, in the medical domain. So we actually need to really get our own act together in the research environment to actually deliver more effectively and transparently to our stakeholders if we want effective action. And lastly, I think there's a real lack of transparency between the research capacity and operational capacity. So often, research outputs are presented to users as suitable for operational decision making, and in many cases they aren't. So it's an okay thing to do, but you need to be transparent that that is the case. And there's a paper by Justine Lacey which actually spells out all of this and more, if you're interested. Make uncertainty your friend. So this is the fundamentals of, say, real options theory in the finance sector, is that uncertainty isn't a problem. Uncertainty is actually the basis for making bigger profits. Because if you can actually manage the negative parts of the uncertainty, you actually cultivate the positive, and the greater the variance, the greater your potential profits. So it's thinking about how you can actually put in real options ideas into conservation, into farming, into urban design, to actually make the most of that changing circumstance. And lastly, as I pointed out before, it's about maximising adaptation learning. So in any circumstance, what you're actually doing is seeing yourself as an ambassador for the community, and you're actually maximising the learning that you can take, so you can pass it on to people like our school friends here. Really important if we're to have an adaptation nation.
There's some organisational factors that mean that that we're not good at planning. Planning's not valued in organisations by and large. Again, particularly at the pointy end, you know, we want to be out doing. So often the people who are at the front line, the doers on the ground, the people go out and deal with landowners or, you know, dealing with threatened species, really begrudge being forced to plan or being forced to actually comply to a plan, because they know, they're passionate about what they do, they know what they want to do. Why the hell do we have to have this plan? And so often the people at the pointy end don't value planning, but often people higher up the tree don't value planning. I get really frustrated when I go to regions when the CEO is not involved in the planning. You know, they just leave it to someone else. It's going to change the organisation's direction, it's going to change people's roles, and yet the CEO doesn't sit in on many of the planning meetings. I understand they're busy, but it's, you know, that's part, to me, that's a critical role. The sort of stuff Mark talked about, that bringing people together takes time. So if we're going to do that well, if we're going to work with communities, it takes time, and you don't do it once and then come back in 3 years' time and you've got the plan together. You have to have ongoing relationships, and relationships take time. And we often say, don't start a relationship, you know, if you're not prepared to maintain it. And I think things like water sharing plans, we have seen how they can persist through. And the reason they persist through is because they've got some of their dimensions of that planning is codified in legislation. And I think we'll have to get to the stage with climate adaptation planning that at least some of it is codified in legislation to make it happen. And notwithstanding what I said before about that's not forcing people to do the plan, but it's forcing them to meet particular standards, if you like, in the way plans are done. Some really important simple things you can do that don't cost any money or much money at all is we can change language. The word plan, when you mention the word plan, in the back of everyone's little brain, a little thing trigger goes off and you either feel, you know, like extremely violent or lethargic. You know, it's kind of like it either elicits from people this massive response. Most people don't like it. We need a new word for plan, and I'll give you $100 if you can come up, and no, serious, $100 cash if you can come up with a new word for plan and planning. And we also need to do the same for Mary, but I haven't got time to talk about that. Focus on the process. We've already talked about that, but it's the process that matters. That's what matters. It's not the document. The documents do nothing. Most documents sit on the shelf. Most of us haven't got any time to read. We don't read past, we flick it, you know, we don't read past the exec summary. So what's the point of producing them? It's the process that matters, so focus on that. Plans are nothing, as Eisenhower said. Cognitively aware, we've heard a little bit about cognitive processing, but you know, we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on climate information, and we spend virtually nothing on understanding how people think about decisions they need to make by comparison. We need to spend a lot of money on how people think and process, how they deal with communication, values and frames, those sorts of things. We need to genuinely engage with this, because this is what's happening between people's ears as much as it is about what's happening out there on the ground or what's happening with our climate. My aim is to, have one day to have someone like Chris or, the other chairs here, Brian, community leaders, being able to stand up in front of their community and say, look, we just went out and we tried this and it was a big failure, but we learnt. And for that to actually be celebrated and accepted, rather than at the moment we've got the cult of success. Nothing fails. We are not allowed to talk about failure. Every single plan, every project was a great success and medal. And we know that's not true. And so why perpetuate the myth? Because we're politically, we feel we can't, but we have to break that cult of success.
Climate drivers are just one part of the picture. So climate drivers then affect systems. Systems respond differently. They've got inherent differences in how they respond. So they've got inherent properties around exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity. We've also modified our systems a lot. So they've actually got some different different levels of exposure and sensitivity and adaptive capacity now as well. So we need to look at that, look at the nature of the system response. And we can see system responses in various ways. Sometimes climate change, interacting with existing system properties, will actually enhance the nature. And so we'll end up with an amplified response to climate change. We've got reinforcing, we've even got buffering. So in some cases the system will, to a certain extent, counteract some of the impacts of climate change. We need to look at that in the context of the implications. How does this impact our goals and our values? Look at our adaptation strategies and then feed that back into what we do. Looking at the response strategies, we've now got response strategies, and this is similar to some of the things that Mark and Paul were talking about, that fall into some broad different categories. There's increasing resilience, where you're really trying to hang on to the system that's there now and improve its ability to adapt in situ. At the other extreme, you've got areas that are going to change so dramatically that you're really talking about a transformational type situation. Examples, and Tony Flaherty's going to talk about his award-winning Samphire Coast project a little bit later. That's an example where we've got sea level rise, built infrastructure, and we're potentially seeing a squeeze of some critical ecosystems in our region there, Samphire systems. And in between, you've got what we're just sort of terming active adaptation, where it's very much the increased resilience scenario, but there are some other things we need to do. We might need to look at refugia, we might need to reinstate habitats, so some more active work that needs to happen there. But there are trade-offs in these strategies. The increased resilience is very much what we're trying to do now in the landscape already, so it's very much just what we're doing now, maybe more and faster. Transformation has some fairly big risks. In terms of, it's going to be expensive, it's very uncertain, and we're probably going to compromise in some situations the things we're managing for now or the values we have now. Active adaptation is that sort of additionality space where it's something different to what we're doing now, but it's not actually going to be a negative impact, it's just something else on top of what we're already doing. So in terms of what, at a really coarse level, that paints for our region, it shows that sort of pinky colour along there, and it stretches all the way along the coast, particularly the sort of soft coastal systems. We're really looking at transformational type scenarios under any of the future projections for that coastal system. When you get into that sort of low rainfall, sort of shrubland mallee country in the Northern Adelaide Plains, we're probably in that increasing resilience through that active adaptation. When you look at the spine of the range, the high rainfall bit, that sort of forest, sort of closed woodland or more closed woodland country, very much the increased resilience scenario. And in the woodland country, the open areas on the sort of eastern western flanks of the range, we're looking at active adaptation to transformation, and those areas vary a little bit in terms of how they're used and how they've been modified. So in a really coarse sense, that's a bit of a picture that's emerging for us out of this work, and what we're doing is we're trying to downscale this work now to really get to the pointy end of actual management interventions, which will be sort of finished later on this year. And that will enable us to really start to talk about specific actions in specific areas and actually roll this out into delivery.